I work for Headland Archaeology at the moment as one of their project managers. Well, that's a lot to follow. I'm sorry I won't be sharing anything quite as exciting as Ken's chariots, so I apologise in advance. But this talk is on burials and bureaucracy. So the term bureaucracy often has negative connotations or is seen as red tape or something stopping us from doing our jobs. But regarding human remains, the paperwork and the legal requirements surrounding burials are there to protect and respect the individual buried, as well as to help and protect those excavating and recording. So it shouldn't be seen as negative in this respect. I'm just going to briefly cover the types of things you'd be looking for on a site regarding human burials and what to do if you've identified a potential burial during archaeological works. I know a lot of individuals here have excavated or worked on human remains before and already know what to do. The first section of this talk is going to be quite basic as it's taken from a training presentation on burials, so apologies if I'm repeating what you already know. But it is worth refreshing everyone's memory, and also to note that sometimes a burial appearing during fieldwork is not quite as straightforward as you'd think it would be. I actually thought I'd do my talk on this subject because over the last few years, I've had to manage various cemetery sites from different religions, which caused confusion because of the slight variations between requirements for each burial and burial ground type. There also seems to be an instant panic when the excavation teams, anything surrounding human remains, it's panic, oh, what do we do? So I thought I'd share a few lessons learned type things with some case studies. So hopefully you can avoid the same confusion. Let me do next slide. Yes. So we're going to do a sort of introduction on burial types and what to look out for. And then unexpected burials by site type. So what to do when you're on trenching, watching reef or excavations. What to do when you're expecting burials. So Welsh Anglican burial grounds, Methodists, Baptists, English Protestants and Catholic, as well as deconsecrated burial grounds are what we're going to cover. Historic burials come in all shapes and sizes and vary between cultures and regions and periods. So we're just going to focus on the UK here and what you might see on an archaeological site and what to do when you do come across a burial. Obviously, this is a short talk and is a very basic overview to refresh memories and get everyone used to terminology and what they'd be looking for. Knowing early on if we've got human remains on a site and what to do about it will ensure that we can all be the most effective we can at mitigating any risks associated with the discovery, including professional, moral, and any commercial issues that might come up. So one of the most common reactions you get from people when you mention excavating human burials, aside from the obvious, oh, how exciting, yay, because it is exciting and we do learn a lot, is why did you have to disturb them? Why couldn't you leave them there? I've had that question quite a lot in the past. Well, as archaeologists, we do try to leave them where they are. We try to adhere to the principles of preservation in situ where feasible. And it's best to leave a human burial and all archaeology where it is for future generations. But there are obviously some reasons that we'll need to excavate and record and remove human remains. And it often does come down to development. A lot of the time, human remains are unexpected and it wasn't known they were there until groundworks have started. So in order for them to not get destroyed, they're excavated and recorded. Or it could be a development that is seen as justifiable, such as a road or rail project or new housing, which might be disturbing the site of a previous cemetery or a known burial ground, but it's seen that the land is not actively being used. So even if there is a record of a potential burial, the living will take priority over the dead when it comes to development a lot of the time. If the remains are going to be destroyed by development, we as archaeologists can record them effectively and professionally and ensure that the burials and the information they hold isn't lost during development. The HS2 project in England is quite a good example of development where it's required the removal of a lot of different burial sites. They were seen, obviously the HS2 route is seen as essential to the country's growth, so a lot of burials were excavated and recorded. Additionally, rescue. So sometimes burials are exposed either through human or natural activity and must be excavated and recorded before being lost or damaged. A good example of that is a few years ago, the rescue excavations at Cumnash, where the archaeologists from GGAT and Cardiff University had to excavate the burials on the cliff edge. So here, multiple burials were eroding from the cliff sands and into the sea, so the team had to excavate and record what they could to ensure that the burials were recorded and to save the stories of the buried. And of course, human remains do tell us a lot about the past that we can't learn from any other type of evidence. So we can learn about the dates, the demographics of populations, individual stature, health, diet, disease, as well as movement and origins using isotopes. So humans are a rich source of information, and studying them does give us a rare chance to learn more. So yeah, of course, regardless of how human remains are found, they should always be treated with care, dignity, and respect, and following the relevant guidelines, which we will go through here. So, common burial types. Historically, burials do come in all shapes and sizes, as we know, but funerary archaeology is a really large subject, and we could talk about it for days. But there will be some people that don't have experience of burial sites, so I thought I'd quickly just go over the types of things you might be looking for when excavating a site, and what it might look like regarding preservation and burial types. The most common types we find in the UK are cremations and inhumations. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. There are numerous forms of burial, some of which we find in the UK as well, such as mummification or excarnation, but these aren't as common, so I'm going to focus on cremations and inhumations. So what should you be looking out for? So cremations can be urn cremations, so they have a vessel. They're more common from prehistoric to modern period, and unurned cremations more common in prehistoric burials, but obviously you do get Roman unurned cremations as well. Earth-cut graves are common from the prehistoric to the current period, and kist burials, sort of tombs, vaults, mausoleums, where the burial is surrounded by a structure of some kind. They're kist burials more common from sort of prehistoric to medieval period, and then you get your tombs, your vaults, your mausoleums from the post-medieval period onwards. So, cremations. Cremation is the act of disposing of a dead body, a person's body, by burning, or part of a funeral ceremony. So in Britain, cremation was the main burial practice from the prehistoric period to the Anglo-Saxon period. So we do find a lot of cremations in the UK. So urn cremations, as you can see an example on the left there, placed within a vessel or container and interned into the ground. Usually the vessels are ceramic, but there have also been evidence for baskets or fabric vessels used in the past. As we move into the post-medieval modern period, we do get cremations. They're more likely to be in metal urns if you're in a more modern cemetery. These examples on the screen are from Bro South Wales. I didn't excavate the site, but I did work on the post-excavation assessment. You can see here that they were beautifully excavated, but also they had multiple urns within one cut, which isn't completely common. Usually you just get the one. But sometimes these were additional family members or additional cremations. A lot of the time they were offerings or funeral pyre rake-out deposits. So where the remaining debris from a funeral pyre after a cremation is raked out and collected, and you deposit that. Urn cremations are best left intact as whole vessels to be excavated in a controlled environment where possible. So on site, what we'd usually do is solidify with sort of cling film or plastic wrapping, and then quickly remove that safely, securely to an area where we can do it in a much more methodical way than in the field. Also on the same site, we had unurned cremations. So as you can see, they're not quite as easy to determine the edges of, things like that, if the pits aren't particularly clear. This is when the cremation material is directly deposited within the pit without a vessel. So depending on the size of the individual or the truncation, cremations might only be visible through a few scrappy bone fragments on the archaeological horizon, particularly if you've got poor preservation, acidic sands and geologies which degrade the bone. You might not even recognise that the fragments are bone. It might just sort of be a cream-coloured powder with charcoal flecks. So yeah, unlike the urn cremations, you can't really lift them completely and excavate. So this one was excavated in quadrants and spits. This is a side note, but I found it really interesting, and it is the Welsh group, so a slight detour, that cremations actually only became possible again in the UK in the late 19th century following a legal battle of a Welshman named Dr. William Price. So cremations had fallen out of favour following Christianity in the UK due to the Christian belief that eventual physical resurrection of the body, so the body was needed for that resurrection. Price was known to be quite eccentric, as you can see from the image there with his druidic regalia. He eventually set up his own druidic group, and unfortunately his son died, his infant son, and he didn't believe in inhumation and wanted to cremate him. But cremation was seen as very taboo in those times. So on January the 13th, he attempted to cremate his son on the summit of Llantrisant hilltop and had to be rescued from a protesting mob by the police. He was arrested and charged in Cardiff with the illegal disposal of a body. But during his trial, Dr. Price argued that the law didn't actually state that cremation was illegal. And the judge actually agreed with him and then released him. So he proceeded to complete the cremation once he was released. And then it was his case and actions that helped to pave the way for the first official cremation in 1885 and the passing of the Cremation Act in 1902. So a bit of a detour, but interesting to see why we suddenly see that stop in cremations, then an uplift again. Inhumations. So obviously inhumation, deposition or burying of human skeletal remains in a grave or a tomb. Again, there are so many different types of inhumations, so I can't go into a crazy amount of detail. But you can get all sorts of positions and types, including supine or face-up burials. People might be very face down or prone, so don't always expect them to be facing upwards. Extended, so laid out in a traditional Christian way, with arms and legs straight or flexed, where part of the body is not laid straight, so arms, legs bent, or crouched, where they're tightly curled, sort of in the fetal position, and any variation or combination of those. Burials can be contained within earth-cut graves, wooden coffins, brick-vaulted tombs, stone tombs, kists, and they all vary a lot by region and period. So if you aren't expecting burials, it's a bit of a minefield out there for when you start digging and find a bone. Oh, is this a human burial? Well, yeah, some other questions you need to answer there. You can also have disturbance or redeposition, which commonly results in scattered bones. And as we saw in Ken's presentation, preservation can vary, and you might not even know that you've had a burial as such. This first photo there is an example of a particularly poorly preserved prehistoric crouched burial. We could tell it was crouched due to the positioning, but not much else you can tell from the bones really at that stage of excavation. Then you've got a Roman burial there, slightly better preservation, slightly flexed at Swindon. And that last image of sort of a common post-medieval cemetery, what you might expect to find there, with very intercutting graves. So potential burials. So you've identified, you've got unexpected bones during fieldwork. What do you do now? It probably goes without saying, but if you find soft tissue or modern clothing, accessories associated with an unexpected burial, or in a burial ground that's supposed to have been disused for over 70 years, best to stop works immediately and call the police, as that sort of find has the potential to be forensic rather than purely archaeological. But you've established that your skeleton is archaeological and not forensic. So if you're working on a commercial archaeological site, you'll hopefully be following the CIfA best practice guidelines, and you'll have an approved written scheme of investigation in place before you start. So your written scheme of investigation, or WSI, should be the first port of call for what methodology you use and what you do when you find human remains on site. It should have been written by the archaeological team working before you started the fieldwork. So usually there's a section about human remains and what to do if you find them. So make sure your WSI document, if you're writing it, had been approved. If your site's in Wales, it would be sent to your relevant regional HENEB trust. But if you're in England or Scotland, it'll be likely the relevant county or city council planning archaeologist. But it could also be Historic England, CADU might want to be involved, or depending on what your site is it scheduled, those sorts of things, that'll all be in your WSI as well. So you've got your WSI in place and you found some bone. do you need to actually excavate and record the human remains? So a lot of people do assume that, yep, you found some human remains, they've got to come out immediately. Actually, it does depend on the type of mitigation that you're doing and on the WSI you're following. So we'll double check that in a minute about mitigation types and how they affect requirements. As mentioned, if the feature is not at risk of being damaged, it's usually best to at least consider preservation in situ first, and whether this is an option to prevent disturbing the remains any more than you need to. If you do need to remove skeletal remains, it's helpful to try and establish if they're human, so you can get a burial license. Sometimes this is fairly easy. You know, you've got your inhumation, it's laid out neatly in a grave cut, and it's very clearly a human skeleton. But sometimes you just get a disarticulated bone, or if you haven't got experience of human remains or bone, you might not have any idea that it's human or animal. The best thing to do in that case is to, if you've got an in-house osteologist, then contact them with some photos and double check, or an Enviro team. If you don't have a bone specialist in-house, do check that the contracts you're working with actually allow you to share site information, because some of them have non-disclosures or privacy issues. So do make sure that if you're liaising with an external specialist, that you are okay to do that. But even if you can't tell whether it's human or animal, the best thing to do is just assume that it's human, just in case. This way you are covered in the eventuality that you have excavated human remains, and if they turn out to be animal bones during assessment, it's still better to have been safe than sorry, so no harm done there. Who do you need to inform? So you'll need to contact the client if you have a client there, stakeholders, to let them know, as it could cause delays or require more work down the line. You'll also need to tell your archaeological consultant if you have one, and you'll need to tell the planning archaeologist that you've been working with. As with all of our work, you also need to make sure that all the actions you're following are in line with relevant standards and guidance, including your CIfA standards and task-specific guidance for the work you're carrying out. And for burials in the UK, another key document is the guidance for best practice of the treatment of human remains excavated from Christian burial grounds in England. Now, although it is focused on England, the information is very relevant to most Christian burial grounds across the UK, so it is definitely worth giving it a read if you're going to be on a Christian burial ground in Wales as well. You also need the relevant consents and licenses, which leads us on to the burial license. Now, a lot of people have heard of a burial license, but so I'm sure some of you have applied for burial licenses before, but as a refresher, we're just going to go through quickly what a burial license is and what it asks us to do. So you can get it from the .gov website after typing in archaeology and human remains. So it's a form from the Ministry of Justice, which is titled Apply to Excavate Human Remains for Archaeological Purposes. So you download the application form, complete the form, and that will need to be sent off to the coroner's office. It used to be considered that you'd only need a burial license if you were going to remove the human remains from a site, i.e. if they were going to be lifted and moved for assessment. And if you weren't lifting, so if you just identified and planned in a burial on site, that you didn't need a license. But that's not true. You do, as it states on the website there, any examination of human remains in the ground, you still need a burial license for that, even if they're not being removed. So this is what the form looks like here. Most of it is self-explanatory, but it is a 6-page document, and it tells you at the end the email address to send it to the coroner. So after you've filled in all your information and you send that off to the coroner, it can sometimes take a couple of weeks, but when it's approved, you will receive your email from the coroner's office containing your license for the removal of human remains, your burial license, which can look a bit like that one on the right there. It is best to print a version out and take it to site with you, particularly if you're transporting human remains. But as long as you at least have an accessible digital copy, you should be fine. Your burial license will state the rules you need to follow when excavating and lifting the remains, which include treating the process with due care and decency, which does fit in with our standards and guidance anyway. Screening the remains from view. So a lot of people do this effectively. but it is a requirement of most licenses to screen the area from public viewing while working. And you've got to outline your next steps in your application, which is agreed on the letter. So usually it's a time frame for reburial or study. What sometimes trips people up is that the remains do need to be reburied in consecrated ground. So sometimes there are instances where museums can display human remains for study, which is requested usually at the application stage, but you can make amendments. It can be a bit strange for people to learn that even pagan individuals or those of an unknown religion are usually to be reinterred within consecrated ground, but it is a requirement and it's what's stated on the burial license. Usually in my experience, we've contacted the local church with the local burial ground and seen if they've got any available space for reburial, if any remains excavated. So, as I mentioned before, it can vary a lot. What do you do with human remains depending on what site type you're working on? So the most common site types we have obviously I'm a project manager in commercial archaeology. So we mainly have watching briefs or archaeological works jobs, trial trenching or evaluation projects, and open excavations or strip map and sample. So trial trenching is one of the most common, and we do it frequently, but it can be tricky when you identify human remains during an evaluation because of the small footprint of the trenches. You're only getting a sort of small window into the site. So again, with any project, your WSI should state a little section about human remains and whether they're to be left in situ or excavated. This is because trenching is actually supposed to be a way to sample and categorize the archaeology. We're not supposed to be fully recording all features of a site as such, but sampling and identifying what might be disturbed during development and to inform on potential next mitigation steps. So for this reason, it might not always be recommended to excavate and lift burials during a trial trench evaluation, as by removing that burial, you've then removed it from the surrounding context, which could destroy valuable information or contextual clues that you may have been able to learn from a full excavation. Additionally, you may only find a small bit of bone, and it might be difficult within the narrow confines of the evaluation to accurately identify whether it's part of an articulated burial or just a disarticulated bone. So obviously removing that removes it from whatever context was beyond the limits of your excavation. Usually if you do identify a burial, the project is likely to go to full excavation. So carefully reburying the remains is often a chosen course of action with those. But of course, if you think the remains are in danger of disturbance, either due to vandalism or grave robbing or temporary development in the meantime, then it's best to fully record, lift and remove. So make sure you're discussing with your planning archaeologists to determine the best way forward there. This is an example here on this page of a recent project I managed in Wiltshire. So Blount's Court. We went on site due to the geophysics, which demonstrated a couple of potential ring ditch enclosures. They're very small. We thought originally maybe roundhouses, something like that. But actually, when we excavated Trench 15 up there in the northwest corner of the site, northeast, sorry, this feature popped up. And the person excavating the trench gave it a clean, very defined edges and a very charcoal-rich fill. So with its proximity next to a potential ring ditch and with it being a charcoal-rich pit with occasional fragments of human bone, well, not human bone, sorry, just bone. We couldn't tell. So just little fragments of bone in there, and it was very truncated from modern agricultural practice as well. So the feature was quite shallow, but I was sent some photos and we also sent photos to our environmental specialist, and from the photos of the tiny bone fragments, none of us could categorically say if the remains were human or animal due to their tiny size. So to be on the safe side, we assumed they were human and acted accordingly, just in case. So first we contacted the client and we let them know that there could be some delays whilst we sort out the correct paperwork. We notified the county archaeologist that there was a potential cremation, and as it was trenching, we asked for some clarity on what they recommended in terms of recording and excavation. So he did want us to lift the cremation as he thought it could be damaged by the backfilling of the trenches, because of its shallowness and the fact that coming back in to excavate might not be the same contractor, it might not be to the same level, it could cause damage. So we followed the procedures to treat it as a cremation and lift it. So we applied for the burial license. We fully recorded the potential cremation deposit as instructed by our environmental team. And we used quadrants going down in spits and recorded each quadrant as a sample. So it was very shallow and there wasn't much surviving bones. So actually in assessment, the fragments were not diagnostic enough. So currently it's being reported rather vaguely as a potential cremation-related deposit while it awaits further analysis. But it does demonstrate the trickiness of evaluation trenches and burials. So another tricky one, watching briefs. Again, very common. A lot of us do watching briefs on development. So this was actually a colleague of mine who monitored a cable route in Hertfordshire. So obviously watching briefs are trickier where we're monitoring the work of someone else. We usually aren't stripping a very large area and we might have an even smaller window than trenching on what's below the surface. Usually a watching brief is required where there is a small potential for archaeology. So finding human remains here was unexpected. Often the outcome is to leave the remains in situ and attempt to divert development works. So these photos are demonstrating, I don't know whether you can see in that first photo, the lower left, there's a bag and that is covering potential human remains. So the watching brief identified bone, quickly realized there was a skull in the section and it was human on this cable route. The route did run close to a Roman settlement, so not entirely unexpected, but still unexpected in this context of the tiny cable route, which is why the watching brief was required due to the Roman settlement. The site team did stop work immediately when they noticed the bone and when it was identified as human, and then the bone was covered, as you can see in the middle there, to protect it from view and any falling soil whilst they decided what to do. It's quite common for the WSI to note to have further discussions following discovery, especially with a watching brief, and upon discussion it was decided in this instance the best case was to record what had been disturbed, leave everything in situ, rebury it, and identify an alternative route for the cable trench. Obviously, this can be a risky strategy because we don't know the extent of this cemetery. They could move 10 meters to the right and hit more burials. But they were quite lucky in this respect, in this instance, that they moved it and they didn't find anything else. So a burial license was still applied for here as the remains were being partially recorded and had been disturbed. So the remains were left in situ, the plastic was all removed, and then there was careful hand backfilling around the area containing the human remains. So it's always nice when you have an open excavation and get full context for the burials you've got. Unlike trenching or watching briefs, if you're conducting an open excavation or a strip map and sample excavation, you'll be fully recording and lifting any burials. It's usually done prior to development where we know that there's archaeological features that will be affected by development. As mentioned, with all human remains, you'll need to apply for your burial license. So if you're expecting burials, say trenching had uncovered burials in this area before and now you've gone to excavation, it's best to get a burial license up front, just so you've got that covered. But if you're not expecting burials and they pop up, apply for a burial license as soon as you realise you've got human remains. This is usually the best way to excavate and record human remains, as you've got all that context surrounding it, usually grave cuts, things like that. As always, contact the appropriate people. We'll go more into that in different cemeteries and things later. This is more sort of unexpected excavations in an unknown or unexpected cemetery. So once you know you need to excavate and record human remains and your relevant paperwork is in place, you'll need to follow your excavation and recording methodology as stated within your written scheme of investigation. The burial shown here is from an excavation of a road development in Swindon. So the burial shown on screen was a completely unexpected find. It was located within a Roman roadside ditch. We knew the ditch was there. A trench had picked it up. And it had picked up some cremations nearby, but no inhumations. So this was right next to the Roman town of Cornovium. So we know that burials are a potential, but we knew about the cremations. So yeah, he was a bit of a surprise, this one. We quickly went and applied for our burial license and waited for that to arrive before we started excavation. But the burial was in a slot across the even 1 meter wide section of this roadside ditch. So we had to expand that to reveal the rest of the burial. Our WSI stated that we would investigate 10% of all linear features, but obviously finding the burial meant this changed. So on instructions of the county planning archaeologist, we 100%ed this ditch, so we didn't miss any more potential burials. To do this, we made an addendum to the written scheme of investigation within our methodology and included the excavating recording of the burial and sampling, and continued this through to the lifting and recording. There were actually 3 inhumations in total within the ditch. There was a rather badly preserved woman who was missing a skull, which might be the one near this individual's feet, the disarticulated skull there. And there was another flexed burial, actually the one you saw earlier with the flexed ankle. He had a little coin purse on him, and a little bit of extra disarticulated. We don't know where that came from. There's a whole arm there. But yeah, as is normal in archaeological sites, sometimes things don't make much sense. But it was very exciting, unexpected. So yeah, it was a good thing that we changed that methodology and 100%ed that ditch. Interestingly, there was also a complete deer skeleton in there. So yeah, very exciting. So that was sort of unexpected burials in various different scenarios. So what do you do if you're working on a cemetery? You know it's a cemetery, they're doing some works there, and you've been asked to excavate either trenches or excavate an area for footings, things like that. So sometimes you might be aware of a burial ground based on earlier maps, or you know you're working in a cemetery and are expecting the burials. In Wales, one of the most common cemetery denominations is the Church in Wales. So as with all human remains, if you're working in a Church in Wales cemetery, you will need to apply for a burial license still. It's also good to remember that sometimes a developer, client, or a landowner will have planning permission in place. And if it's an active church, they'll have the verbal approval of a vicar, but they won't actually know that they need something like a burial license. It's quite an unusual thing in the civils world, really, and any additional paperwork required to carry out the works. So as part of our role as professional archaeologists, we do need to ensure that works are conducted following correct procedures where possible, and maintaining professional standards. So before you excavate any part of a cemetery, do ensure that you or the client has applied for a burial license so that you are covered when working with the human remains. So unlike some faiths, the Church in Wales has a centralised system for the management of burial grounds. They released new regulations in January 2025 surrounding the administration of churchyards. Now, predominantly, a lot of this stewardship guidance from churches is based on people looking after the that are responsible for looking after cemeteries and buildings. But it has been a really good resource for us in the past to determine what's normal, what are we supposed to do, when do we need consents and things. So that document is actually really handy, and it's on the Church in Wales website in their documents section. So part of the regulations state that no grave or vault shall be made or opened without the consent of the incumbent. The cost and expense incurred in making or opening any grave or vault shall be borne by the person at whose request the work is done. In this case, the term incumbent is defined as the vicar or the clergyman responsible for the church. And it also states that in vacant churches, the area dean shall be deemed to be the incumbent person for the purpose of the regulations. So in order for any excavation to take place within a Christian church in Wales, the burial ground, their permission must be granted. And this is in the form of a faculty granted by the Diocesan Advisory Committee for the Care of Churches, or the DAC. So the faculty will likely require and it will state in there, requiring archaeological presence during any works done during the development. And this is unless the church is a brand new building with no previous church association. A faculty is a term used across the UK and refers to a license or authorization from particularly a church authority. It is good to remember that a faculty must be acquired from the DAC, and it's also good to remember that the final decision, although the DAC can permit the works, the final decision does have to rest with the diocesan, that's a really hard word to say, diocesan chancellor, on whether the works can go ahead. So definitely best to wait for the confirmation of approval and written approval. If works are being undertaken as part of development, it's very likely that the person responsible for the churchyard has already been informed and instructed for those works. So in most cases, the council will have instructed as part of the application that an archaeologist needs to be present anyway. So it may already be in place when you start, but just in case, it's always best to check that someone's got the burial license and the faculty in place before you start. Also, if you're working on sites of a previous church or adjacent to a churchyard where the historic extent of a churchyard may have been changed, so for instance, if a road was built, don't assume that there won't be human remains under the road. That's very common on a lot of watching briefs and things we've seen. So make sure that whoever's on site is looking out for signs of disturbed burials under road surfaces. We've recently had one in Hereford Hospital, which is built on the site of an old abbey. And there are a lot of burials under their car park. So they just wanted to extend the car park out, and obviously a lot more work than they thought. So yeah, good to be open to any human remains popping up. Again, an application for removal of burial for archaeological purpose will likely be required, even if they aren't being removed. So ensure you've got that in place, and make sure you're always adhering to your CIfA guidelines and good practice. And as mentioned previously, although it's more relevant to English burial grounds, the guidance for the advisory panel on the archaeology of burials of England is actually a really good starting point, general practice as well for Christian burials. Nonconformist burial grounds. So Methodists, in case you weren't aware, nonconformity was a major religious movement in Wales from the 18th to 20th centuries. Because of that, you've got twin movements against Protestantism by independents or Congregationalists and Baptists, who were joined by the arrival of Methodism. Methodism was part of a wider international movement and began to grow in Wales from the 19th century. So we do have quite a few Methodist chapels here. A 2008 study estimated there are around 341 Methodist congregations in Wales. So to work within a Methodist burial ground, including excavation, a burial license must be obtained, as is standard. However, the land, if the land is associated with the Methodist Church, similar to the Church of Wales faculty system, you've got to gain permission to carry out the works. With the Methodist Church, this is in the form of a formal consent from the Church Council. So there are some slight variations between districts, but generally they all follow the same consents procedure. Usually this is applied for by the building steward when they know that works are going ahead. But if it's a pre-development investigation that you've been asked to undertake for planning, consent might not have been applied for yet, which has happened to us in the past. So ensure that right consent is in place before you start. It may be you that applies or the steward, but as long as it's in place, you can make a start. So Baptist chapels are very similar as well. As usual, you get burial license sorted. And then at a Baptist church, the people responsible for any works associated with the church, properties and grounds is the Charity of Trustees, which is normally the minister, the deacons or elders, or the leadership team who have the overall responsibility. So again, make sure you've got your consent or that they've already applied and that you've got it in writing. This photo here is from quite early on when I was an archaeologist in the field more. So I was called out by Norfolk police as an osteologist to a house in a Norfolk town where a man had discovered a skeleton under his floor whilst trying to install underfloor heating. It was quite strange going into this house, and it was all the walls were up. It was obviously a lovely sort of 19th century building. and he'd been doing renovations, and it went straight down to sort of sandy soil. So I think he was very surprised, one, to find a burial, but two, that he had no foundations on his house. But this burial here was identified. The police were the ones that called us because he'd contacted them thinking he'd had some sort of murder, and they buried him under the floors. But actually, upon recommending the police do radiocarbon dating and we excavated it fully, the burial was around the sort of dated to the 18th, 19th century. Now, on doing a little desk-based search, this individual's house used to be an old Baptist chapel. He was aware that it was part of an old Baptist chapel, but he was not aware that there was an associated burial ground. So he was very surprised. We did notify the local Baptist church out of courtesy. They liaised with us regarding reburial in another cemetery. But yeah, this individual was lifted, and luckily for him was not a murder. Well, not a modern murder. Unlike the church in Wales, which has a centralised churchyard regulation, those within the Church of England are diocese-based. So each diocese may adopt their own policies, providing that these are consistent with the diocesan regulations. There is general guidance available for what to do when working in a churchyard. It's provided by the Church Care on Memorials in Churchyards document on the website. But they're very locally determined. So depending on what diocese you're working in, you need to check with them. Most dioceses actually do have great web pages. So Birmingham and Oxford have nice thorough details on their website about what to do when you're working in a churchyard and what paperwork to have in place. As with the church in Wales, the diocese registrar is responsible for granting the faculties. So you have to apply for a faculty for permission to work within the churchyard and to make any changes such as removing burials, excavating, or moving headstones. As well as good archaeological practice, standards and respect. As mentioned before, the guidance for best practice for the treatment of human remains excavated from Christian burial grounds in England, catchy, is the main piece of guidance for Church of England cemeteries in England. And should be read prior to work starting. Again, it's very similar for Wales, so it's always a good document to refer to. This photo here on the left is from the previous 19th century Park Street Cemetery in Birmingham. So we were required to excavate this one for the development of HS2, as the train station is planned to go directly on top of the cemetery. So it was decided that it was best to remove the burials as they would be destroyed by the development. So we worked very closely with the local church, had a faculty for the works as well as a burial license. Although this cemetery was extant when we started, so the headstones were all in situ, well, partially moved to the edges. It wasn't an active burial ground anymore, so burials hadn't been in there for, I think, about 100 years. A large-scale excavation took place, and we excavated, recorded, and lifted all of the burials. Some lead coffins were present as well, so that's always something to bear in mind with sort of your post-med cemeteries and Roman. Lead coffins were quite common, so for the wealthier individuals. So do be careful. You do have a risk of lead contamination. Also, the survival of soft tissue and hair, which can be well preserved within the lead coffins. Interestingly, on this one, another thing that I hadn't come across before was a lot of mercury. So one individual had obviously, it was a small child. They unfortunately had congenital syphilis upon assessment, but there was a lot of mercury pooling in the stomach during excavation. And it was something I hadn't seen before. So obviously there are heavy metals in some burials, and there are unexpected risks. So with this one, we did work with the exhumation contractors, and they were called over in their suits with the appropriate PPE to deal with the more risky burials. Catholic churches. So like the Church of England, the Catholic churchyard regulations are all separate and diocese-based. And although you do need a burial license, they actually don't require any formal written faculties or consent documentation for work within their churchyard. We did have a recent project involving the creation of a car park at a Catholic church in Dudley. That's the one on the map there. as usual, we applied for our burial license and spoke to the priest, and then we were a little stumped about who else to contact, as he only worked in sort of Anglican and Protestant burial grounds, and obviously we just assumed we'd get a faculty. When we spoke to the priest, he directed us to the archdeacon, who confirmed that actually they didn't have a faculty system in the Catholic Church, and that as long as we had permission from him to carry out the works and planning permission and a burial license, we were all good. So, as usual, it's best to get any permissions in writing and have a copy with you on site, just in case there are any questions about it. Non-active burial grounds. So, as I was mentioning about Park Street, it wasn't an active burial ground, but it was associated with the church at the centre of Birmingham near the Bullring. However, we recently had a site in Birmingham which was the known location of a demolished church. So the church no longer existed. The cemetery was recorded on the maps, as you can see there, but the church was badly damaged by German bombs in World War II and was actually demolished in 1943. So although the existence of the demolished church and burial ground was known, it was not known how much truncation had occurred, or if any of the burials had been removed, or whether the maps were particularly correct about the extent. This was actually, well, it still is, a very built-up area of Birmingham in the centre, and currently on there are multiple roads, hotels and apartments on that area. So no signs of any church or any walls or boundaries. So as it wasn't a registered burial ground, we weren't sure what we needed regarding the paperwork. So as standard, we applied for a burial license, as we assumed it's a cemetery, it's a churchyard, there potentially is some burials there. We then contacted the Church of England in Birmingham for information on the status of the burial ground and potentially to apply for a faculty. However, when we did get through, they hadn't come across this issue before and couldn't find the record of any sort of deconsecrating. Well, also they said you can't really deconsecrate burial grounds, so it's still sort of considered active in that respect. We then weren't really sure what to do at first because they weren't sure, as the faculties actually only cover extant cemeteries and churches who have a registered caretaker, whether that's the reverend, a landowner or the council. So we spoke to the Bishop of Aston in Birmingham, who also didn't know whether a faculty was formally required. But after some deliberation, we spoke to the Birmingham City Planning archaeologist and liaised frequently with the church, and it was agreed that a faculty could not be issued in the instance because the burial ground had been built upon and there was no extant caretaker who was in charge of this. So work continued under the guidance of the Diocese of Birmingham and the city archaeologist, and with the burial license in place. There are many other types of burial ground that I haven't covered here due to time constraints and my own lack of experience with them. So Jewish, Muslim and other non-denominational cemeteries do exist. You've also got military cemeteries. Although I've worked on a military cemetery, I haven't looked for the consents or had to be involved in the managing process for that. But we did have to work closely with the military and the War Graves Commission on those ones. There are also newer burials which sort of blur the lines a little bit. So things like capsule burials or woodland burials grounds, which are quite modern, popping up. There's one in Norwich, I think. So they might have their own requirements in the future. So as always, it's always worth asking whoever is responsible for the cemetery for advice as well. So summary, what you need to do when you identify a burial on an archaeological site depends on a lot of different factors. The type of archaeological site you've got, the location of the burial, primary religions, faiths at the burial ground. Is the burial expected? Is it unexpected? But you usually need at least a burial license. And if you're in a known cemetery, you're likely to be required to apply for faculties or consents. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harriet. That was a superb presentation. Thank you so much. And as a civil servant, yay for bureaucracy. Have to get that in.
Oh, sorry, I'll just unshare. Am I unsharing? No, stop sharing.
Yeah. We have a few minutes for questions. So I can see there's a hand up from Paul. Would you like to ask your question, Paul?
You're on mute, I think.
You're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Is it working now?
It is.
Oh, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. For the I'm studying hazardous museum objects and hazardous archaeology at the moment. I was very interested in your mercury. What did they do? Was it dripping around as mercury globules? And do you know how they collected it?
Yeah, so it was, to be honest, I didn't actually, I was the project officer on this site, and I didn't believe the archaeologists when they came up to me and said, there's mercury, there's all liquid mercury. And I said, well, it's probably lead. Let's come and have a look then. So I went down to this grave, which was a juvenile, and they were troweling, and the mercury was just, and I said, no, stop that, because this mercury was just moving all over the place in these little globules. Yeah, very silver, very bright, as you'd expect in a thermometer. So immediately we had to stop and pass everything over to the exhumation contractor on site. And they were the ones that they had to spray things down. They scooped up and removed a large portion, including, unfortunately, the ribs of the individual, because they were contaminated. The mercury was on top of them. And they put them in plastic bags with hazardous sample labels. And then they disposed of them within their disposal areas, the same as they did with their lead coffins and soft tissue.
Thank you. If it happens again, try getting sulfur powder and putting that in, because that will cause an amalgam to happen with mercury, and then it won't drippy around.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That's very interesting.
Right, do we have any more questions for Harriet? I have one. You mentioned the faculty and the burial licenses. Do you need to apply for one before another? Or can you do it
as long as you
simultaneously?
get both before you start. That's the main thing, as long as they're both in place before you start excavation. Usually the church will be aware. There have been instances such as that Catholic, not the Catholic one, the Christian, who was it? St. Bartholomew. No, it was the Park Street burial ground. Obviously, the client had liaised already. The HS2 and the government officials had already liaised with the church about the cemetery, so they were aware that we needed a faculty. So as soon as we said to them, "Can we have a faculty?" they sort of said, "Yep, here's the link. Fill in the documents," and it was very easy to do. But no, there's no special order as long as you've got them both sorted before you start excavation.
Okay, and then I went to the CIfA conference in Birmingham this year, and the Park Street burial ground kind of featured in a few of the presentations, and I just wondered whether you could give kind of the audience here an idea just of the scale, the sheer scale of what you were engaged in, because I mean that photograph you showed, I mean it showed a very large kind of single span contemporary structure, but what went on inside was mind-blowing.
It was. I hadn't had the experience of that scale of civils work before. So we had, was it 3,000 something burials in there, and in various states of preservation, but most of them were very good. And we had what we referred to as grave stacks, we ended up calling them. Because not only were there two separate areas of excavation, the north side and the south side of the cemetery. The north side was sort of poorer individuals. There weren't many vaulted tombs over there, and the grave goods weren't particularly rich. But on the south side, closer to the church, St. Martin's, we had a lot of richer burials, fake gold teeth, that sort of thing. That was nice. But the burials actually went down to about 4 meters. So it was a lot of effort and work trying to not disturb the burials. What we ended up doing was excavating in spits, hand digging down 500 mil within a grave cut, because the grave cuts were quite defined most of the time. So we'd excavate down, and then we would only reduce the ground level with a machine after we were sure that every grave cut had no burials in it for that 500 millimeters. So it was quite tricky to get everything done. And there were a lot of voids that appeared. So a lot of the backfilling as the burials as the bodies had decomposed, they'd left voids, so it was quite unstable in places. And we had a lot of track matting to add support to the floor. But yes, it was a massive undertaking. We used my first experience of cofferdams. So cofferdams where you have to support with a frame and sheeting. We had a big civils element. We had to work closely with the civils team, especially on certain graves that had been used for a long time, went up to 4 meters deep. And for those, we had to have a safety system in place, a davit hoist system, where you were attached to a harness to be lowered down. So yeah, very exciting. And we had some lovely, I mean, the north side, especially the poorer individuals, very unusual dissection. So the poor law was introduced around the time of the cemetery, which meant that any unclaimed individuals from workhouses could be dissected for medical learning. We had one person had someone else's amputated foot in their skull, in their cranium, where they had a craniotomy. Another person had a marmalade jar. There was a wine glass. We don't really know why. We think perhaps it's because the part of the poor law was that after dissection, the individual had to be reinterred complete. So they can't have parts missing. And we wondered if they'd, taken the brain and wanted to weigh down that burial again. So they'd put something in the cranium. Yeah, but very interesting. Yeah, it was a lovely experience in terms of the learning side of things and the variety of burials.
Thank you. Right, have we got time for one more quick question from the audience? Everyone's stunned into silence. How many archaeologists did you have on site at one time?
Gosh, I think 50, 55. We had a lovely diverse group of people from all over obviously it was sort of pre-Brexit side of things. So we did have lovely European teams, lots of knowledge there, diverse. And yeah, multiple different teams and specialists in every sort of. At one point, I remember we found some buttons that were bone, I believe. And originally we thought someone came up to us and said, we found some plastic buttons. Obviously that does get you a bit worried. Plastic buttons, oh no, do we need to call the police? No, they were ivory. And there was also a comb that we thought was plastic, and it turned out to be an early Bakelite comb. So yeah, really interesting. But yeah, loads of specialists involved, loads of different archaeologists. We worked with Mola on that one, and Don Walker was our chief osteologist on site. So it was great working with him, and he had so much knowledge of all the different traumas and pathologies we were finding.
A massive archive has been generated as well.
Huge.
Yes, yeah. Right, I think Louise has her hand up for a question. Lou?
Yeah, one very, very quick question, and it's regarding treating human remains with respect. What do you know what the latest guidance is on obscuring human remains from view and preventing harm to them? Do you know where that can be found?
Usually what we follow is the guidance, the APAC guidance on burial grounds in England, but also burial licenses state it as a requirement for the Ministry of Justice. So actually on your burial license itself, it says to treat them with respect and screen them from view. Yeah. But currently that's the only place I can think of it written down specifically as screening from view.
Because I couldn't find anything sort of pre-excavation or pre-MOJ license.
Oh, a search. I can't think of anything off the top of my head either.
Yeah. No. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Sorry.